Remember when everybody was talking about the medieval combat game that was going to kill Chivalry? Remember when streamers were going crazy over a game that let you throw your sword at somebody's face and then beat them to death with a loot? Remember when Mordhau felt like it was the future of medieval combat gaming? Well, that was 5 years ago. Today, Mordhau kind of struggles to maintain even 1,000 concurrent players on Steam. It seems like a bit of a shadow as its former self. It did eventually peak over 60,000 players simultaneously at launch, and of course, getting those numbers was never an easy task. But the game itself, whilst having a fair player base, has struggled in the last few years. So how did a Kickstarter dealing with innovative combat mechanics become a kind of a cautionary tale about sustaining online communities? This is the story of Mordhau, a game that did almost everything right, technically, but somehow kind of lost the war against its main competitor, Chivalry 2. It's a tale of passionate developers, toxic communities, content droughts, and what happens when innovation isn't enough to maintain momentum in a brutal world of online multiplayer gaming. Today we're going to deep dive into the rise and fall of one of the most technically impressive medieval combat games ever made, and stick around because there's more twists than you might expect. Mordhau's story begins with passion, pure, unfiltered love for medieval combat games. The team at Triturnion, the developers, weren't industry veterans or corporate developers, but they were a small group of international developers from Austria, Canada, Denmark, Germany, Poland, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden. I could go on and on. They'd spent thousands of hours playing games like Chivalry, Medieval Warfare, and Mount & Blade, even the Jedi Knight series. So they decided they wanted to try something similar. In 2017, they launched a Kickstarter campaign that would start to raise some money. It would raise nearly $300,000, proving there was a genuine demand for what they were offering. You see, Chivalry Medieval Warfare was a game from 2012, and there'd been no sequel, at least no talking of sequels anytime soon. So there was a hunger for something similar but more modern. This wasn't just going to be another medieval combat game though. Triturnion promised something different. The Kickstarter offered $60 alpha access or $40 beta access, serving as the main source of development income for a team of around 10 people who'd been working on a game practically for free since 2015. The core promise was revolutionary, a fluid dynamic combat system that wouldn't rely on preset moves but rather fine control over the weapon. Whilst other medieval games used predetermined attack animations, Mordhau would give players direct control over their weapon's trajectory. You could drag attacks, morph strikes mid-swings, and create complex combinations that felt more like real sword fighting than video game combat. They also promised the game would never be an early access title, with the scheduled launch of March of 2018 being the full package. And this was a bold statement, especially for a small development team with a Kickstarter in an era where early access had become the norm for indie multiplayer games. The technical ambition was staggering for such a small team. They promised 64-player battles, detailed character customizations, multiple game modes, and a combat system so sophisticated it would make Dark Souls look simple. All of this running on Unreal Engine 4 with the kind of graphical fidelity that would make AAA studios jealous. Of course, though, reality had other plans. The game was eventually released on the 29th of April 2019, more than a year after its original proposal. The delay was pretty significant, but given the complex nature of what the game was attempting, it was perhaps inevitable. The development process revealed challenges of creating such an ambitious combat system. Every weapon needed to feel distinct, every attack needed to be readable yet fluid, and the netcode had to handle dozens of players swinging weapons with precise timing. This wasn't just about making attacks look cool, it was about creating a combat system where milliseconds mattered and player skill could genuinely shine. During the extended testing period, something interesting emerged. Players who stuck with Mordhau through its alpha and beta phases became incredibly passionate advocates for the game. They understood the depth of the combat system and were willing to invest hundreds of hours mastering its intricacies. But this same complexity that thrilled hardcore players would later become a barrier for newcomers. The testing community was small but dedicated. Players created detailed guides, analyzed frame data like it was a fighting game, and developed techniques that the developers hadn't even considered themselves. Moves like drag attacks and excel strikes and morphing became part of an increasingly complex meta that required serious time investment for a player to master. This could have been something incredible, but in other ways, it was a bit of a warning sign. While the hardcore community was loving the depth, casual players were already at this point struggling to keep up. The game was developing a skill gap that would only start to widen over time. So, we get the game in April of 2019, and while the response was pretty explosive, the game released to a surprisingly good start, with 25,000 people playing simultaneously. Despite Despite having unstable servers and bugs that prevented certain people from saving progression, just 6 days after launch, Mordhau had peaked at 60,000 concurrent players, and this stabilized for quite some time. It became an instant hit on streaming platforms, content creators drawing to Mordhau's spectacular combat and hilarious moments. Watching someone throw their weapon, catch it midair and decapitate an opponent was pure gold for YouTube. The game's physics engine created endless moments of emergent comedy and epic battles. Critics praised Mordhau's technical achievements, and the combat system worked exactly as promised. It was deep, skill-based, and unlike anything else in gaming. The character customization was extensive, the maps well designed, the game ran surprisingly well for such a small development team. But even in those early positive reviews, warning signs were visible. Critics noted that the game had a steep learning curve, limited tutorial content, and could be brutally punishing for new players. Some reviews mentioned concerns about long-term content support from such a small team. The community was electric with enthusiasm though. Mordhau memes flooding gaming communities, the game's ability to create cinematic moments like cavalry charges, siege warfare, or dueling with historically accurate techniques captured imaginations. Players were creating content faster than anybody could consume it. But success brought its own problems. As the initial excitement wore off, a troubling pattern emerged. Player count dropping is very natural in gaming, as not every player is going to keep playing a same game one time after another. Mordhau's combat, whilst brilliant though, had created an environment where new players felt an almost entirely impossible learning curve. Experienced players could kill newcomers so quickly and efficiently that just wasn't fun for either side. The veterans wanted challenging fights, while newcomers wanted to actually play the game. Forums filled with complaints from new players who felt like they just couldn't compete. Unlike other multiplayer games where map knowledge and aim could help new players occasionally succeed, Mordhau required an understanding of some complex mechanics that took hundreds of hours to master. Triturnian, the developers, tried to address this with matchmaking improvements and tutorial updates, but the fundamental issue remained, and this was the game's core mechanics. The same thing that had made it so successful in the first place for its launch hurt it in the long term. Balance patches became contentious affairs. Changes that helped new players often angered the hardcore community who'd spent years mastering specific techniques. Changes that preserved high-level play continued to alienate casual players. Triturnian found themselves caught between two incompatible versions of what their game should be, and this led the community to fragment. Hardcore players formed private discords and custom servers that they could fight other skilled opponents, and the casual fans, well, they either quit entirely or stayed in beginner-friendly servers that experienced players often invaded anyway. Another critical issue started to emerge as well: the content. It was infrequent and often smaller than the community expected. Triturnian was a small team of highly skilled international developers, and whilst their size allowed for creative independence, it also limited their ability to produce content at the pace that modern multiplayer games requires. Months would pass between significant updates. When content did arrive, it often focused on new weapons or minor map additions, then fundamental changes needed to address the game's accessibility problems. The community grew increasingly frustrated with the pace of development. Communication became another friction point. Updates from the developers were sporadic and often vague. Players wanted to know what was being worked on, and the problems wouldn't be fixed, and what the long-term vision of the game was. The lack of clear communication created anxiety in a community that already concerned with the game's future. Social media presence was minimal compared to other competitive games, and there were no regular developer streams, few behind-the-scenes updates, and limited engagement with community feedback. This silence was interpreted by many players as abandonment, or at least a lack of interest in community concerns. Then, the threat many were expecting: Chivalry 2. Torn Banner Studios, the creators of the original Chivalry Medieval Warfare, announced that they were returning to medieval combat with lessons learned from both their original game and Mordhau's innovations. The original Chivalry Medieval Warfare was nearly a decade old by this point, and at the time it was a unique proposition in multiplayer gaming, a first-person slasher with realistic combat and large-scale medieval battles. Now they were back with a sequel that promised to combine Chivalry's accessibility with modern production values. The approach was a bit different from Mordhau though. While Mordhau focused on precise skill-based combat with a high skill ceiling, Chivalry 2 was much more forgiving, and its learning curve not as steep as Mordhau. They prioritized spectacle, accessibility, and immediate fun over deep mechanical complexity. So when it launched, the differences were so clear. New players could jump in immediately and have fun, even if they weren't winning fights. The game emphasized cinematic moments, environmental kills, and chaotic medieval warfare over these precise Mordhau dueling mechanics. It was everything that Mordhau wasn't: accessible, immediately gratifying, and designed for mass appeal. And this meant that many people started to leave to play Chivalry 2. As a community member noted, players found that this game seemed way less polished than Chivalry 2, and Chivalry 2 just seemed more immersive and more fun. The migration just wasn't about better graphics or marketing though, it was fundamentally about the approach to the community. As Mordhau's player base started to decline, decline, another problem emerged that would accelerate its downfall: community toxicity. The game's high skill ceiling and competitive nature had attracted players who took this stuff very seriously. The combination of voice chat, detailed character customization, and medieval themes created the perfect storm for issues. Players using a historical setting as an excuse for weird roleplay, others becoming incredibly hostile towards new players who just couldn't compete at their level. And then the famous response. Tritonian struggled to address these issues very well. With the small team focusing on technical development, community management wasn't their strong suit. Reports of toxic behavior became unaddressed for weeks, and when action was taken, it seemed like it was too little too late. This started a vicious cycle. The community became more hostile, the players were being driven away, and the player base shrank. The remaining players became more elitist and unwelcoming. They even made it harder for newcomers to stick long enough to learn the game. Even content creators started to avoid Mordhau for some of these reasons. The game that started as a goldmine became a liability for many people. By 2021 and 2022, Mordhau's decline became undeniable. At the moment, Mordhau has about 700 to 800 concurrent players. This is 77% lower than its previous peak player count of 3,373 achieved on the 29th of March 2024. The game that boasted around 60,000 players on launch was falling, and not slowly either. The decline isn't just about raw numbers though, it's about the quality of the multiplayer experience. With fewer players, matchmaking times increased. Regional servers became empty, forcing players to connect distant servers with high latency. The 64-player battles that have made the game famous became rare as servers struggled to fill. Community forums became increasingly pessimistic. Players were asking, is it even worth playing, and does it have a good player base? And even wondering why it takes so long to get into games. Long-time supporters began recommending that new players avoid the game entirely. Meanwhile, Chivalry 2 maintained a healthier player base and received regular content updates. By some metrics, both games had reached a similar player counts, which were kind of low, but Chivalry 2 with cross-platform seemed more sustainable. Tritonian have made several attempts to revive the game. They added new game modes, implemented better tutorials, addressed balance issues, and even modding. But looking at the decline, some of the problems are clear that might not be able to be fixed just with patches. In contrast with Chivalry 2's approach, Mordhau has more options for competitive play, offering ranked versions of its flagship modes, where Chivalry 2 just doesn't do that. Chivalry 2 made conscious decisions to prioritize immediate fun over long-term mastery, the combat more forgiving, visual feedback clearer, and the game emphasized spectacular moments over technical precision, whilst hardcore players might still prefer what Mordhau has to offer. However, when it comes to marketing and it comes to community engagement, Torn Banner, who make Chivalry, seem more engaging. They provide regular updates, engage with content creators, and maintain active social media presence, and Tritonian don't seem to do that, at least not quite as much. And today it's left Mordhau in a strange liminal space. The game currently maintains not enough players to have full servers, not enough community to have a fun player experience, and not enough accessibility for more people to come into the game. Community organized tournaments and events still go on, showcasing the incredible skill ceiling that Mordhau's combat enables. Watching high-level Mordhau play is genuinely impressive. These events still prove that hardcore gaming was good, but just not big, and I think that's the biggest issue. So what really happened to Mordhau? The simple answer is that it became a victim of its own mechanics. It created something technically brilliant, but struggled with the non-technical challenges that determine long-term success. As one player noted, they're both great games, speaking of Chivalry 2 and Mordhau, but with questionable communities. Mordhau feels deeper, the skill gap wider, and it can be unfriendly until you learn the ropes, but once you start to click with it, it's a rewarding experience. The game that focused on real skill and determination and making authentic medieval combat perhaps went the way, perhaps fell short when it came to actually making a fun experience for new players to come in. The story reminds us that in multiplayer gaming, the best product doesn't always win. Community management, accessibility, and understanding your market are just as important as innovative gameplay mechanics and technical excellence. But let me know what you think. Do you think the game has a chance of coming back, or do you think it's just about time for waiting for Mordhau to maybe announce a sequel very, very soon?